The USS Scorpion was one of only 2 nuclear submarines ever lost by the U.S. Navy.
That's right. It sank in 1968, and the question is why?
But what if everything you were told about a U.S. Navy disaster was a lie? In 1968, 99 American sailors vanished aboard the USS Scorpion. The official story? A tragic accident. But newly declassified files and eyewitness accounts in 2025 tell a very different story, one involving cover-ups, Cold War tension, and a terrifying underwater attack. For over 50 years, the truth was buried deep beneath the Atlantic. Until now, like, subscribe, and join us as we uncover the haunting truth behind one of America's most chilling maritime mysteries. The Silent Depths. May 1968. The Cold War was boiling beneath the surface of the world's oceans. A powerful nuclear submarine of America's most advanced vanished without a trace. 99 men were on board. The official story was simple: a tragic mechanical failure. But buried beneath layers of classified silence was something far darker. And it began on a quiet night in the Atlantic Ocean, where no one heard the screams. The USS Scorpion was no ordinary vessel, a skipjack-class nuclear-powered attack submarine. She had prowled the seas as part of America's silent fleet during a time when the world balanced on the edge of nuclear catastrophe. On May 22, 1968, she was returning home to Norfolk, Virginia, after a deployment in the Mediterranean. The Cold War's icy grip held firm across continents, but below the waves, the tension was even more perilous and more secretive. As the submarine sliced through the Atlantic depths, the sky above was clear. Calm seas stretched for miles. The Scorpion cruised beneath them, a steel shadow in a silent war. The men aboard were weary but content. It was nearly the end of their tour. Letters home had been written. Family reunions were close. Commander Francis Slattery, the 36-year-old skipper of the Scorpion, was a veteran of submarine warfare. Known for his professionalism and cool demeanor under pressure, Slattery was respected by his crew. Among them were seasoned sonar operators, engineers, and young sailors experiencing their first deployment. Many of the men had grown close during their time underwater. Stories, jokes, even fears were shared in cramped quarters. These were not just officers and enlisted men, they were brothers in pressure and silence. And they had no idea that they were living their final hours. By naval protocol, submarines on patrol must check in with their command at scheduled intervals. These communications brief encrypted signals confirmed the vessel's status and position. On that night, however, the Scorpion failed to report in. It was just one missed message. But in the world of submarines, silence is ominous. The initial response from Naval Command was routine. Technical delays, interference, no cause for alarm. But inside the Atlantic Submarine Force headquarters, tension mounted. An eerie absence had settled in. The Scorpion's silence did not fit protocol. And worse, it didn't feel like an accident. Over the next several hours, military communications centers on both coasts were abuzz with quiet panic. High-ranking officials met behind closed doors. Radar and sonar logs were reviewed. Satellite trajectories rechecked. Families were told nothing. By May 23rd, despite public reassurances, the Navy had quietly elevated the incident to a full emergency. Commanders suspected something catastrophic had occurred. Yet publicly, they maintained the facade. No reason to worry, they said. Minor delay. Internally, however, one word began to spread. Submarine missing. The search began with urgency and desperation. Destroyers, frigates, and reconnaissance aircraft were scrambled across the North Atlantic. Thousands of square miles were scanned for any signin oil slick, debris, a ping. But there was nothing. The sea gave up no clues. And still, the Scorpion was silent. Unknown to the public, however, the Navy had already received the first real evidence of what had happened. Deep in classified command bunkers, acoustic analysts began reviewing data from one of the Navy's most secret tools. The SOSUS system. The Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, was a Cold War network of underwater microphones laid across the ocean floor to track Soviet submarines. What it picked up on the night of May 22 wasn't ordinary. It was a low, thunderous boom. Then, moments later, a second, sharper sound. The analysts knew what they were hearing. The first was an explosion. The second, the implosion of a submarine hull under extreme pressure. Those at the top now knew what the SOSUS data meant. The Scorpion had suffered a catastrophic failure. The exact cause was unclear, but the timing, location, and acoustic signature left little doubt. She was gone. And yet none of this was shared with the public. Not yet. The families still waited. On May 27th, 5 days after the last transmission, they gathered at the dock in Norfolk. Some brought welcome home signs. Others clutched photographs. But at 3 p.m., the Navy delivered its verdict. The USS Scorpion was officially declared missing. No survivors expected. The code phrase was Event Submiss. It was the coldest phrase imaginable. No details, no comfort, just an abyss. But the real mystery wasn't just that a submarine had disappeared. It was how and why. Official explanations were vague. Mechanical failure, perhaps. But behind closed doors, some whispered another possibility. The Scorpion hadn't failed. She had been attacked. And so began one of the darkest chapters in Cold War naval history, one that would take more than 50 years to unravel. Sounds from the deep? While the world searched the surface for answers, the Navy already had its first clue, and it came from the darkest parts of the ocean. Hidden beneath thousands of meters of water and layers of Cold War secrecy, classified underwater microphones had captured the Scorpion's final cries. But what they heard didn't sound like an accident. It sounded like war. The sound surveillance system, SOSUS, was one of the U.S. Navy's most closely guarded secrets. A vast array of hydrophones laid across the sea floor, it had one purpose: track Soviet submarines. From the Arctic to the Caribbean, it listened to everything that moved beneath the sea. Only a handful of intelligence officers even knew how to interpret the eerie symphony of low-frequency echoes from the abyss. In late May 1968, as the Scorpion's absence triggered international concern, acoustic analysts at naval intelligence facilities began reviewing SOSUS data from the North Atlantic. They weren't looking for shipwrecks. They were trained to detect enemy submarines. But what they found would change everything. Lieutenant Commander David Ingram was one of those analysts. A decorated sonar technician turned acoustic intelligence officer, Ingram had spent years decoding the underwater language of submarines. The distinctive beat of propeller blades, the high-pitched whir of pump jets, the hiss of cavitation. He knew what each sound meant until May 22, 1968. That night, while reviewing tapes from the Azores Triangle region, Ingram froze. He had just heard something that no training could explain. The first sound on the recording was deep, resonant, a sharp burst, unlike anything natural. A few seconds later, a second sound hit. A sickening collapse, lower in pitch, like the slow crumpling of a steel drum beneath immense weight. These weren't whale songs or earthquakes. They were violent, mechanical, intentional. Ingram cross-referenced the timestamp. The exact moment the Scorpion had gone silent. The location? Less than 400 miles southwest of the Azores where she had last been heard. He replayed the clip over and over. Each time, the same dread crept over him. This wasn't a malfunction. This was destruction. By morning, Ingram's findings were on the desk of Admiral John Hyland, commander of Submarine Force Atlantic. The Admiral's reaction was swift and silent. No press briefings, no family notifications. He convened a top-secret meeting with Naval Intelligence, the National Security Agency, and key officials at the Pentagon. The conclusion was tentative but chilling. The Scorpion had suffered a sudden external explosion, perhaps a torpedo. Perhaps something else followed by a rapid hull implosion as pressure crushed the breached vessel. To the trained ears of Navy analysts, this acoustic pattern didn't suggest internal failure. It was too fast, too violent. Something had hit the Scorpion first. And yet, not a word of it reached the public. Instead, the official story remained vague. A missing vessel, last contact unknown, communications difficulties. But behind closed doors, panic was spreading. The implications were staggering. If a Soviet submarine had sunk an American nuclear sub, the Cold War had just escalated in the most dangerous way possible. The Scorpion carried not only 99 men but nuclear torpedoes. Admitting an attack could ignite the very war they were trying to prevent. And so, a decision was made. Seal the data, classify the SOSUS tapes, destroy internal memos, maintain the illusion of mechanical failure. Ingram was ordered to forget what he had heard. He never did. Even as naval assets combed the Atlantic and families held out hope, the military's inner circle already knew the truth. The Scorpion was lost. The men were gone, and the real cause, whatever it was too explosive to reveal. The event was officially designated submiss. No explanation, no accountability. Yet within intelligence circles, whispers circulated that the explosion had come from outside, that a Soviet Victor-class submarine had been detected nearby. That signals intercepted by satellite intelligence pointed to evasive maneuvers hours before the attack. But all of it was buried beneath security clearances and shredded transcripts. The public narrative? The Scorpion experienced a probable internal failure. But inside closed rooms, the tapes told a different story. And they wouldn't remain buried forever. Years later, retired analysts like Ingram would testify quietly, off the record, that the Navy knew the truth within 72 hours, that the sea had whispered it to them, and that they were told to turn away. The ocean doesn't lie, but people do. The inquiry that didn't ask. When a U.S. nuclear submarine vanishes, the world expects answers. And so, in the summer of 1968, the Navy launched a formal inquiry into the USS Scorpion's disappearance. But what unfolded wasn't a search for truth, it was a carefully staged performance. And the most damning evidence? It was never shown. On the 5th of June, 1968, in a quiet room deep within the Washington Navy Yard, a group of high-ranking officers, engineers, and government officials gathered. Their mission: determine what had caused the loss of the USS Scorpion and the deaths of 99 American sailors. The setting was designed to feel official flags, formal uniforms, transcripts prepared, but behind the solemnity lay a different agenda. Unseen by the public, the inquiry was bounded not by curiosity but by politics, and the questions it didn't ask were louder than the ones it did. Rear Admiral Thomas Moorer, future Chief of Naval Operations, chaired the panel. A hardened Cold Warrior, Moorer understood the stakes. To him, the Scorpion wasn't just a tragedy, was a flashpoint in a geopolitical chess game. Alongside him sat engineers, intelligence officers, and legal advisors, all bound by the same unspoken rule. National security comes before closure. Among the witnesses called to testify was Captain Robert Fountain, a submarine commander who had operated in the same region just days before the Scorpion vanished. His words were clear, measured, but his eyes flicked nervously whenever the Soviets were mentioned. Despite weeks of hearings, the inquiry quickly veered away from the most critical questions. The SOSUS data-clear recordings of an explosion followed by an implosion were barely mentioned. When they were, the terminology was buried in jargon. Anomalous underwater acoustic event, unverified transient signal, and no one said the words that echoed in private intelligence briefings: attack, torpedo, Soviet sub. Instead, the board focused on technical theories: battery explosions, faulty torpedo systems, potential flooding scenarios. Experts explained how a hydrogen leak could ignite. Charts were presented showing thermal buildup in the engine room, but none of these possibilities matched the known acoustic timeline. And the panel knew it. Internal memos later, Declassified, revealed that the Navy had already reached a conclusion before the first hearing began. The Scorpion's loss was most likely due to internal malfunction. This phrase became the refrain, the safe narrative that kept Cold War tensions from boiling over. Several witnesses tried to raise doubts. A sonar specialist testified that the explosion pattern suggested external force. A propulsion engineer noted that similar battery failures hadn't caused hull implosions on other subs, but their testimonies were quietly redirected, edited, or omitted entirely from the final report. In one instance, a signal intelligence officer attempted to bring up intercepted Soviet communications from May 22. He was quickly cut off. Outside the scope of this inquiry, the game was rigged from the start. After weeks of staged testimony, the board issued its conclusion. The cause of the USS Scorpion's loss could not be definitively determined. Possible factors include mechanical malfunction, accidental detonation of onboard ordnance, or unknown system failure. It was a non-answer carefully crafted to appear thorough while revealing nothing. To the families of the 99 sailors, it was a second death sentence. They had endured silence, then waiting, then this. Vague, technical jargon in place of accountability. At the memorial service in Norfolk, as folded flags were handed to widows and children, not a single Navy official mentioned the possibility of an attack. They couldn't, because they already knew too much. The final report was sealed. Classified appendices containing the acoustic data, intercepted signals, and movement logs of nearby Soviet vessels were locked away in Pentagon vaults. Years passed. The Cold War raged on, and the Scorpion faded into the background of a conflict too dangerous for truth. But inside naval circles, dissatisfaction brewed. Some officers couldn't live with the silence. They whispered among themselves, passed notes during training exercises, left clues in private memoirs. They knew the inquiry had failed not because of incompetence, but by design. And so, the official story remained intact, sealed behind bureaucracy and fear. But the real story was still alive, carried in the memories of those who had seen the redacted reports, heard the forbidden sounds, and sat in rooms where the truth was sacrificed for peace. The investigation may have closed the file, but it had opened something far more dangerous: doubt. And in the decades to come, that doubt would fuel a search for answers that even the U.S. Navy couldn't control. A wreckage too troubling to reveal. 5 months after the USS Scorpion vanished, the Navy announced it had finally located the wreck. But what they didn't say, what they couldn't say, was that they had found it long before, and that what they saw on the ocean floor contradicted every word of the official story. It was October 1968, when the Pentagon released a carefully worded statement. The Scorpion had been found 3,000 meters beneath the Atlantic, resting in pieces on the ocean floor, roughly 400 miles southwest of the Azores. Photos followed. Grainy, stark, a broken steel hull, crushed by unimaginable pressure. The narrative was tidy: accident, implosion, tragic loss. America mourned, and the media moved on. But what the world saw was only a fraction of the truth. Because in classified memos and internal Navy logs, documents that wouldn't surface until decades later, the wreckage had already been located in June, barely weeks after the Scorpion disappeared. The real search wasn't led by rescue ships, it was led by USS Compass Island, a special operations vessel outfitted with advanced sonar. Alongside it was USS Mizar, a cable repair ship secretly repurposed to find sunken submarines. And at the heart of the effort, elite crews from Deep Submergence Systems Project, trained for missions that didn't officially exist. Among them was a sonar operator named Lieutenant Jerry Caswell, whose personal notes released posthumously reveal a disturbing detail. In his words, the damage pattern didn't look like a collapse. It looked like it had been torn apart. The photos taken by underwater cameras told a story the Navy wasn't ready to share. Sections of the hull were blown outward, not inward, suggesting an explosion from outside the submarine, not a pressure-induced implosion. The conning tower was twisted violently, as if sheared by a force far greater than structural stress. And most alarming, the torpedo room was missing, obliterated entirely. No one could say for certain what had happened there, but multiple engineers concluded that an external blast was the most plausible explanation. Worse still, some debris showed signs of scorching thermal damage, consistent with high-energy detonation. Internal fire? Maybe. But combined with the outward ripped plating, it painted a different picture altogether. One too dangerous to acknowledge. In early July 1968, months before the public announcement, a report labeled Top Secret Scorpion Analysis was circulated among a handful of Navy and National Security Council officials. The contents were damning. SOSUS had recorded 2 separate explosive events. The first consistent with a torpedo detonation, the second with hull collapse. Soviet submarine K-129 was confirmed to be operating in the same quadrant just days prior. Visual inspection of the wreck supported a theory of external engagement, but rather than prompt a diplomatic crisis, the White House issued a quiet directive. Delay announcement. Craft neutral public narrative. Emphasize technical malfunction. Why? Because admitting that a U.S. nuclear submarine had been sunk possibly by a Soviet torpedo-would force a response. And in 1968, with Vietnam raging and the Cold War at a boiling point, a single provocation could have ended civilization. Secrecy, once again, became the strategy of survival. The decision to withhold the truth didn't just affect policymakers, it shattered families. Relatives of the 99 crewmen, still clinging to hope, were told only that the Scorpion had suffered a catastrophic failure at depth. No explanation, no details, no closure. Widows stood at Arlington, accepting folded flags, unaware that behind them sat men who knew more than they'd ever admit. Fathers of young sailors wept over stone markers, never learning that their sons may have been killed in silence to preserve peace. In one declassified letter, Rear Admiral John Smith wrote to the Secretary of the Navy, "The wreck's condition is inconsistent with known mechanical scenarios. Further disclosure risks geopolitical fallout. Recommend immediate classification of all visual records and acoustic data." And just like that, the truth was sealed away. Publicly, the Scorpion's discovery became a footnote in Cold War history. A tragedy, yes, but an accident, explained away with diagrams and engineering reports sanitized for public consumption. But the real findings were filed under code-word-level access. The men who had seen the wreck firsthand signed lifelong non-disclosure agreements. The photos were buried, the tapes erased or redacted. Those who asked too many questions found their careers mysteriously stalled. To the government, it wasn't a lie. It was a national security necessity. But to the families, it was betrayal. The Scorpion became a monument not just to the dangers of the deep but to the price of silence. And yet, fragments of the truth endured. A sonar log copied and hidden, a whispered conversation at a reunion, a retired officer breaking down during an interview decades later. The wreckage was too troubling to reveal, too dangerous to admit, and too haunting to forget. But buried secrets have a way of rising. And in the years to come, those secrets would begin to speak not from the mouths of officials, but from eyewitnesses who could no longer carry the weight of what they knew. Eyewitnesses break their silence. For over 5 decades, the Navy's version of events was treated as gospel. But in the shadows, men who knew the truth carried the weight of silence. Until 2025, when one by one, they stepped forward. And what they said shattered everything. It began quietly. A letter to a journalist, an anonymous tip to a Cold War historian, a retired sonar analyst agreeing reluctantly to an interview, under the condition that his face remain hidden. But it didn't stay quiet for long. As newly declassified documents emerged in early 2025, they weren't met with silence, they were met with corroboration. Eyewitnesses, insiders, men who had worked inside the command centers, who had pored over sonar logs, who had heard the panic in the voices of commanding officers when the Scorpion failed to check in. They weren't theorists. They weren't speculators. They were the men who had been there. Robert Bob Merriman had served as a communications technician in Norfolk in May 1968. He was 22 years old, sharp, obedient, and trained to never ask questions. In a televised interview aired in April 2025, he finally broke that code. The night the Scorpion went silent, something changed in the control room. Orders started coming in fast, direct from the Pentagon. We weren't told what happened, but we were told to watch for interference, and we all knew what that meant. And his eyes, aged but clear, filled with the kind of weight that comes from keeping a national secret for half a lifetime. He wasn't alone. Another whistleblower, Commander Gerald Baines, who had served in the Office of Naval Intelligence, recounted a chilling message intercepted just hours before contact was lost. "We had signals showing a Soviet sub operating just outside our monitoring range. Then it disappeared. So did the Scorpion. Coincidence? No one in that room believed it. And these revelations ignited a storm. The Navy responded with familiar denials, no new information, no indication of hostile action, speculative testimony. But the interviews kept coming. A retired SOSUS analyst revealed that his team was ordered to sanitize acoustic logs before they were presented to the court of inquiry. His original report, which described 2 distinct underwater explosions, was rejected and replaced with a simplified version stating a possible implosion event. End of we knew what we heard. The first bang wasn't a collapse, it was a hit. Then silence. Then the crush. Meanwhile, families of the 99 men lost in the Scorpion watched in disbelief. For decades, they had mourned under the assumption that the Navy had told them the truth. Now, that trust was crumbling. A coalition of families, researchers, and former Navy officers launched a formal request to Congress: reopen the Scorpion investigation. They weren't alone. Public sentiment had shifted. News networks ran primetime specials. A best-selling book, What Sank the Scorpion, sold over 1 million copies in 3 weeks. Online forums exploded with newly released sonar maps, recovered logbooks, and side-by-side photo comparisons of the wreckage damage evidence that seemed to confirm what insiders had said for years. And perhaps most damning of all, a document from the National Security Council, dated June 1968, surfaced during a FOIA dump. It included this chilling line: "The appearance of hostile engagement cannot be excluded. Disclosure would constitute a threat to strategic stability." Translation: they knew. The turning point came during a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing in June 2025. A former naval captain, testifying under oath, revealed that he had personally delivered sealed acoustic tapes from the Azores hydrophone array to the Pentagon in May 1968. The tapes captured what he called a sequential signature consistent with torpedo impact, followed by structural collapse. Pressed by senators on why these tapes were never disclosed, his answer was simple: because they told us not to. The hearing room went silent. Reporters rushed to get statements from Department of Defense officials. Families in the gallery wept. One senator, visibly shaken, called for an apology from the Navy for 50 years of deception. But for many, no apology could undo what had already been done. In the weeks that followed, the Pentagon released hundreds of additional documents, some heavily redacted, others curiously vague. But a pattern emerged. The Navy had intercepted communications, suggesting a Soviet sub was shadowing the Scorpion. Sources confirmed a 2-stage acoustic event matching the time of the disappearance. Visual inspection of the wreckage suggested external trauma inconsistent with mechanical failure. These were not the musings of conspiracy theorists. They were official records. And they revealed a cover-up born not of malice, but of desperation to preserve Cold War peace at the cost of Cold War truth. The USS Scorpion now rests in history not just as a lost submarine, but as a symbol of secrecy, sacrifice, and the voices that refused to stay buried. For decades, the silence had protected national interests. Now, it was the truth's turn to surface. And as Bob Merriman said in the closing lines of his interview, the Navy told us we were protecting the country by keeping quiet. But the families weren't the enemy. They deserved to know. And now, they finally do.